Hello, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk with these authors and have them share their books with you guys. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press that publishes historical novels. Before I bring our authors on, let me just talk a little bit about the features here on Crowdcast. So you'll see there is a chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. In the lower right, you can say something nice. So go ahead and introduce yourselves to everybody. Let us know where you're joining us from, maybe your favorite book or something you're reading right now, anything like that. We also have on the right-hand side of the screen, that's when you can toggle between the chat, the Q&A, and also the people, so you can see who else is joining us today. So that Q&A box, if you do have a question for any one of our panelists, go ahead and type your question in the Q&A there. And if you don't have a question, you can actually look at the questions and vote for the one that you like the most or the one that you think should be asked. And then as we get towards the end of the event, I'll look at that Q&A and pick out a few questions to ask our panelists. We also, I don't see it right now, but there is a call to action button on the bottom. It says get your book. If it's not there, I apologize. I'll see if I can get it up later. But if you go to historythroughfiction.com/what's-new-in-historical-fiction, you can find the books by these panelists, and there are links to where you can buy those books. And we encourage you to support these authors and get these wonderful books. Okay, without further ado, then, I'm going to bring our panelists on and have them introduce themselves. So let's begin here. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of What's New in Historical Fiction. I'm really excited to talk to everybody. So Kimberly, Garrett, Brown, if you could begin and tell us about yourself, about your book, and if you could read a short excerpt for us.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm Kimberly Garrett Brown. My book is called Cora's Kitchen, and it is a novel that's set in 1928. And it's about a woman who works at the Harlem Street, 135th Street library, who would like to be a writer, but the responsibilities of her life and the current time of racism and sexism has kind of kept her from doing what she believed, what she would dreams to do. She strikes up a relationship, a correspondence with Langston Hughes, and that sort of begins the novel. And that is what where things take off a little bit from there. And so the thing that I'm going to read is her first letter to Langston, because throughout there she ends up having to leave her job at the library and working in the kitchen of a very wealthy white woman, and so things happen from there. So here's my little excerpt. New York, New York, April 12th, 1928. Dear Langston, I read one of your poems a few days ago and thought I would write you a letter. I hope you don't mind. The library's not been the same since you went away to school. There are still spirited discussions about race relations at the forums and new authors reading at the Book Lovers Club. But no one talks about poetry, books, or writing the way you and I did over the last year. I know it sounds odd to say no one talks about books at the library. People have conversations all the time, but they're mostly superficial. Someone will say, I love this or that about a book, but then will not be able to describe why. It's like there's no appreciation for the words. No one takes the time to savor the story. A patron came in to return a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. I asked him what he thought of Songs of Myself, particularly 21, and he responded, it was nice. I stood there, astonished. How can you come away from Whitman with it was nice? The opening of stanza 21 takes my breath away. I am the poet of the body. I am the poet of the soul. The pleasures of heaven are with me, and the pains of hell are with me. The first I graft and increase upon myself, the latter I translate into new tongues. One stanza conveys the urging of the body and longing of the soul. I feel the complexity of heaven and earth within my own life. It's a blessing to work at the library surrounded by books and words and ideas. I have a friend who studied to be a teacher, but no school would have her because she's colored. She works for a white family as a maid. She helps the children with their lessons from time to time, but she will always be more mammy than tutor. So while there are times I feel more like a clerk than a librarian, I know working here is better than cooking or cleaning for a white woman. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I love that line. How can you come away with Whitman with this? It was nice. That's quite true. Well, let's go
Such a
on.
yeah.
Let's go on to Kim. So we have Kimberly, and then we have Kim Taylor Blakemore. Kim, why don't you introduce yourself and read a little excerpt for us?
Thank you all for being here. I'm so happy to be with all of you. My novel, The Deception, comes out on September 27th. There's the cover. And I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 3 from one of the characters named Clementine. And the story is about a medium who has hired a trickster and fraud to help her get back her reputation and fame. So this is Clementine, chapter 3. The path Clementine took was narrow, worn to ruts by mourners who'd carried so many a coffin up Horse Hill and returned empty-handed and in silence after the burial. She zigzagged through oaks and birch and then cut through a stand of pines before dropping to the water. The river, swollen from all the rain, grabbed at the long grasses. Her lantern swung and spread little light, the mist thick as pudding. At least the horrid rain had stopped. The fresh grave slopped with mud, and every dig of the shovel let another rivulet of water fill the hole. The ground grew even more slippery, and not once, but twice, her boots slipped when she had to claw her way out. But Harriet needed her proof for tomorrow night's seance circle. So she traveled the old coffin path and waited for the gravekeeper to take to his cottage for evening psalms and a meal. Elmira Parker, devoted wife of Herodotus, was now with the Lord at 87 years old. Clem lifted the lid and squatted to bring her candle close. Happy to be dead, Mrs. Parker. The old woman's mouth was curled into a grin, a rictus of toothless, eternal joy. Clem patted the cold cheek. Then she set the candle on the woman's chest and proceeded to snip a lock of her hair, unfasten her lace collar, and roll the beaded velvet bracelet from her wrist. She folded them in linen, stuffed the bundle into her wallet, then blew out the candle and filled the hole. The trip back took half the time as the trip up. Midway, she jogged to a stand of oak, unbuckled the rucksack she'd stashed there earlier, and peeled off her wet clothing. All of it was shoved into the sack, along with the iron cat's paw, so much more efficient than a crowbar. She was glad she'd stolen it last year, and a pair of pliers. She patted the chest pocket of her coat to confirm the takings remained intact. Dressed now in simple widow's blacks, she meandered the rest of the way down the hill, then out the gate.
Very nice, very immersive. It makes me think maybe you did a little firsthand research.
Yeah, I always like dig into graves.
So thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Well, next we have Martha Conway. Martha, if you could tell us about yourself, your book, and read an excerpt for us.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I see some familiar names on the screen, including my sister. My book is called The Physician's Daughter, and it's about a woman, Beta Tenney, who wants to become a doctor right after the American Civil War in 1865. And of course, all the obstacles that she faces. I'm just going to read a quick scene from the very first chapter. She's waiting to tell her or to ask her father to discuss whether or not she can become a doctor when a couple of men from town bring in a man who has collapsed. Her father is a doctor, a country doctor, and this takes place in their house. Sherman Tillings, who owned the saddlery in the public stable and had a wife named Thankful, was at the injured man's head. Vida didn't recognize the other man holding the Boston man's ankles. "We was just changing horses for the Boston coach," Mr. Tillings explained. "He collapsed on the porch, didn't say a word. Where can we set him?" Her father directed them to the long sofa against the windows in his office, where the light was best. "Not one word," Mr. Tillings went on, lowering the man onto the green velvet upholstery. "A Boston man. You see where his forehead is swelling? Cracked the rail when he fell." The man's face, closed eyes, open mouth, had a waxy tinge, like skin on hot milk. Was he breathing? Vida, who had seen many an injured man brought into their house, stared at his chest, but couldn't make out a rise and fall. "Shall I fetch a blanket?" she asked. "It's important to keep the extremities warm," her father always said. He sat down on the stool next to the sofa and put his ear to the man's mouth. Then he placed 2 fingers against his wrist. "No pulse," he announced. He told Tillings to prop the fellow up while he opened a bottle of whiskey. Holding the bottle by the neck, he pushed back the man's head and poured a glug down his throat. "To encourage the swallowing reflex," he said. But the man didn't swallow. 2 uneven streams ran down either side of his beard. "Get a hot poker, set it against his head. That'll shock him awake," Tillings said. "Or blow tobacco smoke into his mouth," suggested the other man, the coach driver, who was small and freckled, with wiry red hair. "Nonsense." Her father began massaging the man's chest. "But perhaps I can work up the heart." "Work it up?" Vida asked. The human heart, with its auricles and ventricles and valves, its precise oscillation, was to her a miracle of engineering. She had seen her father perform countless exceptional procedures, setting badly broken bones, draining pustulous head wounds, and once he made an incision into a man's bladder to extract a stone the size of a fig. But she had never seen him restart a stopped heart. Scientifically, it seemed impossible, but there was so much she didn't know. She stepped closer. I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Martha. It's corpses are a theme, it seems.
Yes.
Hopefully there aren't any technical difficulties. I did get a text from my sister, said that she was having trouble with Chrome. She switched to Firefox. So if any of you out there are having technical difficulties, you might just have to switch browsers. Well, let's go back to Kimberly. Kimberly, I want to ask you about your main character, Cora. I'm always interested in authors and their main character because you get to know them so well over the course of writing a novel. So can you tell us more about who Cora James is and your experience of getting to know her?
I certainly can. She's an educated woman, and she's a woman who doesn't whose education or what she is or how she feels about life and herself is really kind of squashed by the time period. So she doesn't really get to fully be who she is. There probably a lot of that still now too, but I think it was definitely much more prevalent during that time. And getting to know her was sort of interesting because when you're writing a book, you have to, as the author, you have to figure out a way to get to know your characters. And one of the ways that I sort of engaged with her was that I would give her. I'm a big journal. I like to journal, so I journal a lot, and I gave her my journal. So I would ask her a question and sort of see what she wrote about. And I didn't necessarily think that the novel would turn out to be a collection of her journals, but that was really how it started. Like I would say, so what's it like, or what do you think about this, or what do you think about that, or and I would let her write about it. And so that was kind of some ways I felt like, are you losing your mind? Because it feels like you're being kind of inhibited by another personality. But that is the way that I really sort of engaged with her in the beginning to try to get deeper into who she was.
That's a fantastic idea. Great technique, I guess, for craft technique for getting to know your character. Because I know I've had some trouble getting to know my characters when I'm writing, and you try to write some background scenes that you never intend to put on the page. But I think, yeah, really learning more about their voice by giving her your journal. I think that's great.
Yeah, like I said, it was very eye-opening, but I was like, I hope you're okay, Kim. You know, as you're doing this, I hope you're not like, multiple personalities or something, but it was very eye-opening.
Well, I think that's fairly common among fiction authors to, yeah, really take on the voice of that character. Well, Kim, let's move to you. I'm really fascinated by the premise of your novel, and in the excerpt alone, there is just very tantalizing. So, can you tell us more about mediumship and spiritualism, especially what it was like in the late 1800s when your book takes place?
Place in 1877. So that is about the burgeoning of the spiritualist movement within New England. And then that went overseas to England and then all over the country, where people, it was a very uncentralized sort of religion. They wouldn't call themselves that, but they were people who definitely felt they could commune with the dead. And so there would be mediums who came and would do parlor seances and try and raise the dead or get things to levitate or have voices come through. And this became very popular during the Civil War, particularly when there were so many dead and so many mourners and people wanting to talk to their loved ones that they'd lost, which was a ripe opportunity for opportunists and tricksters and frauds who said, I think I can use a little magic and get the same solace and comfort for that mourner. And so the fraudulent part of that business of psychics and mediums grew right alongside the authentic mediums themselves. So the story is about a fraudster, a fraud, and a medium, and their relation to each other, and the ethics of that. Of does it matter the means if the ends are the same? So it was very, very fun to research spiritualism at the time and read the papers. There were papers all over the country. One was called the Banner of Light that had really interesting articles in it of people talking about mesmeric fluids and how the telegraph going across to the Atlantic Channel. And well, if we can do that, then we can definitely use the same idea to communicate with the heavens and part the veil. And it was very, very fun to research.
And did you talk with any current day mediums?
I did. I really wanted to make sure that Maud, who is the authentic medium, she's lost her spirit guide in the book, and that is why she hired Clementine to help her. I wanted to make sure she wasn't a Hollywood version of a medium. So I interviewed two mediums, and one was very, very helpful, telling me her story and how she became a medium, what happened to her from childhood on. And then I was able to very specifically tell her about Maud and what I was doing with her. And she guided me and made sure that, there's all different ways you can be a psychic, but Maud is a clairaudient. She hears spirits. So fascinating talking to her. And I talked to a man who's called the historical conjurer, who does 19th century magic all over the country. So I was able to say, here's Clementine, and she does these things. Was it possible in 1877? So he guided me to the correct chemicals and the books that I could find. That I can't share some of the things that I learned in these books about how to create spontaneous fire with chemicals we are not allowed to have anymore. But it was fun to learn how to do.
Yeah, it sounds like a blast, and I mean, good for you for seeking that authenticity, making sure you had it right. Excuse me. Well, Martha, let's go to you and talk about your main characters, Vida and Jacob. We got to see Vida a little bit there in your excerpt, and what she was introduced to. So, what are the decisions that they face, and what is their relationship like?
Well, when I first envisioned this story, I saw it as a kind of Taming the Shrew meets Grey's Anatomy. And I still think that's a fair description. although it did, of course, evolve and change as I wrote it. As I said, Vida Tenney, she's a young woman who has always wanted to study medicine. And after the Civil War, she thinks, now's her chance. But her father wants her to get married instead. So that's when Jacob Culhane comes in. He originally was kind of a throwaway character. I just saw him as one in a line of suitors, but he kind of grew and got his own scenes and chapters and points of view. And pretty soon he became almost as prominent as Vida. I just was very interested in his story and his background. Jacob fought in the Civil War, and in the last year, he was imprisoned in Andersonville prison camp, which you may have heard of. It's notorious for its horrific conditions. It was there's not enough food, a lot of starvation, a lot of illness. Also, the prisoners had no tents, no living quarters of any kind ever. They had to sort of dig holes in the ground or cobble together something for themselves. So he survived it, and he came out the other end. But of course, he has demons himself, and he has this dream of starting a business with the man that he credits as having saved his life. He and this man wanted to start up this little business together, but the man did not survive Andersonville. And that is Jacob's ambition, whereas Vida's ambition, of course, is to become a doctor. So my challenge or my question as I went along was whether Vida and Jacob could form a partnership, and what would that look like, or would they just always be at odds with each other?
And how far are they able to take it before she's got to make a choice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they kind of fall for each other. They didn't intend to, and there's a point in the middle where Vida has to make a choice between ambition and love, basically. On a deeper level, what she has to do is learn how to trust. Does she trust Jacob? And that's the point where their paths diverge. And I guess you'll have to read the book to find out if they come back together or not.
Certainly. Well, I've got some more questions for our panelists, but remember, if you have a question, head over to the Q&A. I see we do have one question there, so I'll get to that a little bit later. It looks like Anne was having trouble with the feed, so I apologize. It's kind of outside of my control at this point. But we do have it on Facebook as well. So if you head over to Facebook and search History Through Fiction, it should be right there on our Facebook page if it's not working for you here. Let's go back to Kimberly. Kimberly, I'm curious, you're more than just an author. You are a publisher. You have a Minerva Rising. Can you tell us what it is and why you started it?
I do this. The mute. Yeah, Minerva Rising was started right after I finished my MFA as a reason, an answer to rejection. That's really what it was started. I had just, finished an MFA, and I was sending out a bunch of manuscripts and short stories and things, and I kept getting rejection. So I thought, you know what, I should start my own journal, and so I did. And what I didn't know is that does not do anything for getting your work published, but I felt strongly about helping other women get their work published. And so Minerva Rising is a women's press. We started out as just a literary journal, but now we also do poetry, chapbooks, memoirs, and fictions. We do all of those things. And it's really just a creating space for women to tell their stories, and just encouraging and coming alongside women, which is very important to me. I do have to add a sidebar because as fate would have it, our server, Bluehost, is down the last 2 days. So if you go to the website today, you may or may not be able to get on. They are working on repairing that. So I just want to add that part in there. I'm like, I can't believe that is happening this week when there's more light on the host press type thing.
Sure. Are you accepting submissions?
Yes, right now we have 2 contests going now, and we will have another one that starts I think at the end of the month. We have a chapbook contest, which is called our Dare to Be contest, and we've I can't think of off the top of my head. This is probably the 8th or 9th year that we've done the Dare to Be chapbook contest. We also have a memoir contest that's going on, and then our Rosemary Daniel fiction prize will start later at the end of the month, and that is for short stories, short story collection or novels, and those are open. And we're always accepting submissions for our online magazine, which is called The Keeping Room.
Very good. Before I move on from you, I am curious to know what your thoughts are on the new perspective it gives you running your own press, because authors kind of view rejection as a badge of honor. It's a part of the process, but it's infuriating at times too, because you have to go through so many rejections. How did your viewpoint change, or how are you able to add to your perspective once you got to see the other side of the coin?
I would say that I understood that rejection sometimes has nothing to do with the quality of your work. And as a publisher and editor, that sometimes is the hardest part of having to reject a piece. There are times when we've had when we do a journal where it may be the same subject matter, and we're like, we can't do all 3 of those. We need to pick one, and it's a hard choice. Um, it's such a hard thing to do. So I think when we get a rejection, we always think that they're making some commentary on our ability as a writer. And sometimes it's just not that simple. Sometimes it has to do with whether or not the storyline fits with the press itself. You know, it may not fit with what their aesthetic is or what their mission is in some way, which has nothing to do with the writing. Or it could just be that you've run out of space, or it just doesn't fit for some reason or another. It doesn't make it easy. In fact, this is a cop out, but I never send rejections. I have people on staff that do that because it breaks my heart. If it was up to me, I'd publish just about everybody, because I just believe that, you know, we all work so hard as writers. It breaks my heart when I have to send them. So to answer your question, yes, absolutely, it's changed my way. It doesn't mean that when I get one, I don't feel the same thing most writers feel, but I know in some place in my mind that it's not quite as personal as we tend to think it is.
Yeah, some great points, good reminders there. It's not always personal. It's just nature of the business.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Kim, I want to ask you about the genre that you write in. So you have a lot more than just historical fiction going on. You have some mystery, some gothic fiction. How challenging was that to combine all those different genres, and how did you balance them all?
Well, I absolutely love all 3 of the genres. So how do I put them together? And all my books are suspense or thriller. So there's always a dead body somewhere. Uh, anyway, what I do is it always starts with primary sources, right? I find something, I run across something, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. What can I do with that? And then I'll start reading different books. And again, I try and really stay away from books that are written now about things. I may look at them for kind of an overview of stuff, but I really try and dig further. And like for this book, I found 2 really interesting reads. One was the biography of Mrs. J.H. Conant, which was written, I believe, in 1877. And she was a very famous medical medium at the time. I found a PDF of it. So I read all about her experiences. And then I found another one written in 1880 about called Confessions of a Medium. And it was a man who wanted to be a medium, and he gave up his dream of being a priest to follow another guy and be a medium. And as he's going along, he sees the scam and tricks going on and realizes the whole thing is just fake. And from there, I'll just move in and go like, how do I add that in? I love the atmosphere of Gothic. I really love playing with that sort of idea of who can you trust at any moment. It's really fun to play with. So to me, it just all sort of fits together without not necessarily intentionally.
So did it take much, I mean, in the editing process, to strike that balance, or like you said, it just kind of happened naturally for you?
It just sort of all fits together. I'll sort of plot out some of the main scenes and sort of go, well, this is a thriller, or this is a suspense, or what are the main elements, and who's the dangerous woman in the story. I was right about dangerous women, and then sort of let them take the lead at that point and see what happens.
Well, I want to ask one of the questions here from the audience because they have a specific question for you, Kim. Diana Stephen says, your book sounds fascinating. After communicating with the mediums, did you become a believer in mediums and their psychic abilities?
I'm a believer because I've seen a lot of ghosts. I've had a lot of ghost experiences in my life. The first one when I was young, I was at Gettysburg, and a whole set of men came running down the hill and threw me at the same time. I was like in kindergarten or something. But my mother told me they were ghosts. One of the mediums I talked to was in the process of figuring a way to certify mediums because there's so much fraud in that industry. So I'm very skeptical about mediums to begin with. You can see their tells, you can see, if you follow them and watch, you can see their reads of people and how they do things. Magicians use a lot of the same sort of misdirection and trying to pull from the audience for things. So it was really interesting to talk to one who said, no, we're figuring out how to certify them. They have to prove what they do. So I want to actually get back with her and see what they figured out as their test. How do you prove this? Because it's easy now. You can find so much out about people on the internet, or you send marks. You just find a mark in the audience and send two people as a couple, and they start talking to someone, and they say, "Oh, my son died, and such. What about your family? Oh, yes, it's so terrible." And then the couple goes around backstage and goes, "The people sitting in the back row over there lost their grandfather. His name's this, and this is what happened. They told us." So lots of skepticism, but I do believe the authentic ones.
Well, yeah, the whole thing, the whole science behind it, and the whole art behind it sounds quite fascinating. We won't get into your ghost stories. Maybe we'll save that for another time.
Sure.
Martha, I want to ask you about the quotes you have at the beginning of each chapter. Now, these are real primary source documents. Can you tell me about what you discovered in those, and why you decided to put them at the beginning of each chapter?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just read one, if that's okay, so you get an idea. But yeah, as you were saying, as Colin was saying, I have text from primary sources at the beginning of every chapter. This one is by Dr. Hugh Lennox Hodge from his book on diseases peculiar to women. And he writes, hysteria is often excited in women by indigestion. So, all of us, I'm sure, we when you write historical fiction, you do an awful lot of research. I'm sure I'm not alone when I say I read a lot of primary texts, and all of these. I read so many contemporary accounts by scientists and doctors and professionals, all about women, about their health, about their sexuality, about their minds, about our minds, I should say, just about everything. And some of them were horrifying. Some of them were humorous. And I wanted to include them because I think it shows a certain cultural mindset. And of course, when you're talking about fiction and drama and obstacles, the mindset of your culture can be a huge, and usually is a huge, obstacle for people. Just proving to your neighbors and to your family and to your friends and everyday people that the culture is wrong about you is daunting. So I wanted to include some of those, and I guess I was also thinking that, you know, these quotations, they show a mindset, and they also show how hard professionals, most of them are doctors, male doctors, how hard people work to preserve the status quo, and how they say these statements that are remarkable, but they seem to believe them because they really want to keep the status quo, and that's because, you know, it benefits their own group. So I think that is interesting then. It's also interesting now, and it's just a little window into what was going on at the time.
Yeah, that's quite a leap to go from digestion to well, anyways, did you ever get over that, like, sinking feeling or whatever it was, that shock? Like, how could they possibly say these things? Or were you always just like shocked by it?
I kind of was always shocked by it. And in fact, I came across something that was written recently by an editor of the, I think it was in the New York Times, you know, one of their book reviews. I won't name names, but a very prominent book reviewer who sort of pulled out this male writer's idea about women and said how interesting and true it was, because it talks about women's squirrely logic. And I'm paraphrasing, he didn't say it exactly in that way, but it was sort of shocking to me that, you know, even today, some people find a way to repeat ideas that we think we're done with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's go back to Kimberly. You're quite a prolific writer. You do a lot more than just fiction. You've got poetry and nonfiction, short stories. Um, what is it about the expression through writing that you find so appealing? And yeah, what do you enjoy about writing so many different ways?
I think it's just it depends on what can best tell the story. I think that's probably what it comes down to. There are times when um, it's fun to fictionalize something, or maybe I think about a what if scenario. I have a question from real life, and I create something in my mind that says, "What if it were this way?" I've also written short stories. One short story I wrote, I was sitting at the bar waiting for a friend, and I overheard this first date, and I was so astonished by what the woman said that I ended up writing a story about what she said, which is kind of odd, but it's true. So it might be, you know, what inspires me, but other things that are maybe more personal, you know, that don't speak to being fictionalized, then I write more of essays or short stories or things about that. It just depends on how I'm feeling, or the genre I feel that is best suited for the story or for what it is that I'm trying to say.
Well, so speaking from my experience, I got an MFA in fiction, but in my program, you could pick creative nonfiction, you could pick poetry, you could pick screenwriting. Did you have to learn each craft, or you just picked it up naturally?
So I have two writing degrees, and so my first writing degree was more of a generalist type writing degree, and we had to you did a lot of different types of writing. You could write sort of creatively, but you also had to do a lot of kind of more, not necessarily academic, but research oriented writing, the type of thing that you might get, say, in a New Yorker type of article where you tell a story, but there's a lot of research type involved in that. So for that particular degree, I learned to sort of write in a variety of different ways, but my MFA is in fiction. And so that is where, um, you know, most of the stories are actually the whole program for me, because it was dedicated to what you were particularly studying. You know, everything that I did for that, except for annotations and things like that, were fiction. So it wasn't about studying the different things. I think some of it is particularly with creative nonfiction, some of the things that you learn as a fiction writer can be applied to essays and things like that too. So it wasn't like the situation where you could jump around and write different things.
Well, I want to continue with our questions here. We do have some more Q&A from our audience, so I'm going to look to those. So if you do have more questions for our panelists, please put those in the Q&A. But Kimberly, somebody does ask, can they find you on Instagram? Also, somebody did ask about your press again, so maybe if you could mention the name of your press one more time.
Okay. Yes, I am on Instagram, and it's under Kim Writes. It's pretty easy. Common spelling, Kim Writes. And the name of the press is Minerva Rising, and I could put it in the chat so that people can see it too.
Great. I do also want to thank those that have contributed here. I was going to do that off the top in my introduction here, but we are a small press, independent literary press, and the tickets are free, but we really appreciate anyone who made a contribution. That helps us continue these events and host more of these events, and helps pay for this platform. So thank you for those who have contributed. I do see a question here that everyone can respond to if you have something to add. So someone, let's see, Ron asks, how do these authors balance writing with their personal lives? So Kim, do you have something you can speak to that?
Right, and I am a developmental editor, and I have a writing community that I run. So I sort of balance all those things together with my rescue dogs and my family. I guess that's what I would say. So it's all sort of writing and books and related in my life.
And do you have to have an itinerary, plan out your days, or just
I
whatever?
plan out my year.
Okay.
So I literally follow a calendar, production schedule, a calendar, and try and hit all my goals all the time. So I can't live without that.
Martha, how about you? How do you balance things?
I love the idea of a production calendar. I haven't thought of that. I'm a little bit worried that I would make one and then, the 14-year-old in me would rebel immediately and just not do it. But I do think it's really super important to have a structure and have a schedule, because otherwise your family life or your home life will just take up all your time. At least I found that was the case for me. So I try to write from 9 to 12 every weekday. My weekends, usually I keep free, but now that my children are grown, I have started writing during the weekends as well. But if I don't have a set time to write, then it just doesn't seem to happen. And so for me, that's really important. And luckily the people around me understand that and they support me. And so I'm very lucky with that.
And how about you, Kimberly? How do you balance all your different writing endeavors?
Well, I wish I was more like, I used to be more like Kim, I guess I should say, where I wrote things down and did tasks and things like that. And I keep trying to go back there. But I guess I would say I'm mostly deadline driven. So if there's something that is got a pressing deadline or something that's coming up, I tend to work through those things first and foremost. And much like Martha, my kids are adults now. And so I don't have that same kind of, I don't have that same kind of commitment when I was, a full-time mom in the sense of they lived in the house and things. So I guess what I say in balancing is it's what's important. I think for me with writing particularly, when I feel like I'm off or I'm cranky or I'm like just feeling like something is just not right in my life, I know that's because I'm not spending time writing. And that's when I tend to try to put it back up to the top of the list. And that drives it mostly a lot more now, because before, I think because I was on schedules, I tended to put it in. And now I know if you're off. You need to get back to that.
Yeah, as for me, I just always keep a list and cross things off and prioritize based on what's due next, and sometimes you need that extra help. Well, I saw we had someone who raised their hand, and I was KF Mayor. If you want to join us on stage and ask your question, go ahead and raise your hand again. I haven't done that before on What's New in Historical Fiction, but why not? It looks like she put her hand, or he or she put their hand down. But if you want to raise your hand again, I will invite you on stage to ask your question. But looking at the Q&A here, I see I've got a question for Martha. Martha Diana asks, I loved your novel. I thought you handled the conflict between Vida and Jacob very well. You kept me guessing. Are you a plotter or a pantster? I think fly by the seat of your pants, that means maybe.
Yeah, that's something. First of all, hi, Diana. Diana is somebody that we've never met in person, only over social media. So that's sort of fun. We're both writers, and she has written wonderful historical fiction that takes place in the Ukraine. So check her out as well. So plotter is somebody who plots, pantser is somebody who writes by the seat of their pants. And I think I fall a little bit in between the two. I do have a plot. I always know when I start out what my character wants, and I usually know whether or not she gets it in the end. And some, if not all, of the obstacles that she's going to be facing. Other than that, I'm constantly revising and evolving. My books are never what I thought they were going to be. The plots, the storylines are never what I think they're going to be. So that can be frustrating, but it's also very, it's also electrifying. I mean, it's fun to decide to swerve and do something new and see where that takes you. It does usually probably take me longer to write a novel than maybe some other people, but that's sort of my joy. That's what I love to do. So for me, that's a fine compromise.
Well, we've got a few more questions here. Sorry, I was just reading through those as you were speaking, Martha. I'm going to combine Shirley's and Jacqueline's question. We have one that says, what's been the most unexpected, interesting, or unusual sources of research in your book? And Kim, you kind of covered that a little bit already in when you've been speaking. And then the another question is, what was the most surprising thing you learned in research for your book? So I guess either or. So Kimberly, maybe what's one thing that was surprising, or maybe a surprising or unusual source of research for you?
I would say one of the biggest surprises, I loved prior going into writing the book, I was a huge fan of Langston Hughes. I just loved his poetry and everything about him. And the more I researched, I kind of came away toward the end like, I wasn't quite sure I liked him as much as I thought. And that kind of surprised me. But I guess it was when you start doing a deep dive into people, then you're disillusioned in some ways, I think, or can be disillusioned, I think, some way. That was one of the bigger surprises to me.
How about you, Martha? Well, I mean, we covered maybe surprising, shocking, even to see the viewpoints of the past, and maybe even some of the viewpoints of the present. Anything else that surprised you, or an interesting source that you found?
Oh, well, there were a lot of interesting sources. One was this book called Aristotle's Masterpiece, which is a real book. It's sort of, I think it was first published in the 1700s, not by Aristotle. They just used that title, to get readers. And it's sort of like a 18th century sex manual. It's very bizarre, but I think it was also for midwives, and it explains all about different physical aspects of men and women, some of which they get right, and most of which they get wrong, but it's just hysterical. So that was a sort of, I didn't expect to find a sex manual written that early on. The other surprise that I had was, as I was researching early female doctors, women doctors, I suddenly realized that almost all of them had fathers or husbands who supported them and were their champions. And there were a few deans of medical colleges across the country who also really believed that women could be excellent doctors. So it was nice to see, once again, that there are these shining stars in history, these unsung heroes who really help to make a change in the culture. So I was sort of expecting just everybody to be against women doctors. And it was nice to see that in some cases, that just wasn't true. And they really did make a difference.
I think that's great. And I have to admit, my only knowledge comes from Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. I grew up watching that in the 90s, and I still see reruns of it today. But yes, I should definitely check out your book. And
I was a little afraid of that comparison, but what can you do?
Yeah. Well, Kim, do you have anything to add to that about something you found surprising?
There's still a spiritualist school you can attend to this day. I looked it all up. I thought it was very interesting. It went from comparative religion, and then you could split off from that if you wanted to become a medium or if you wanted to study the philosophy and be a teacher. I was like, it still exists.
And you registered, didn't you?
I had a moment where I thought I should, because it'd be really good for research if I can actually call up the spirits. And then I thought, no, you don't like them when they come, so don't even go down that road.
Yeah,
So
I would
get
as far away from that as possible.
They're very nice, but I don't necessarily want to see them.
Well, I see I've got one more question here from the audience, so I'll ask that question and then I'll wrap it up with one more that I like to end with. So Katie McGlade asks, I'm interested in how you each have dealt with rejection, which seems to be so much part of the writer's journey, and what got you back in gear. Kimberly, how do you handle rejection?
Well, I first start off upset about it. I guess it depends on what, though. Sometimes there have been times when I've gotten a rejection that's just felt crushing in some ways. And those are the ones that it take you a moment to jump back from. But other ones, I'm like, okay. Sometimes in my mind, I think about the salesman approach. You know how I guess I never was a salesman, but I heard that you're supposed to knock on 10 doors or something like that, or some amount of doors before you get a yes. And so sometimes I try to think about that once I get over the emotional part of it, which can last from a couple minutes to maybe a few days, depending on where it comes from.
How about you, Martha?
Yeah, it's hard, and it's sometimes, just like Kimberly was saying, sometimes it's shocking and takes you a while. Always when it's a surprise, you think that something's in the bag and it isn't. The times when you were sort of like, I didn't think that was really going to happen anyway, that's a little easier. But I definitely find that the challenge is not to take it on as though, as Kimberly was saying, it's saying something about me as a writer, and to start questioning my own abilities as a writer. And once, if I can get back to whatever I'm working on and work on that, those fears seem to go away. So I think the challenge for me is to get back to whatever I'm working on as quickly as possible, because that's really where the joy is for me. That's what I love to do.
And I think it's maybe important to remind people here that the whole process is another part of the research, of the writing, of the finding your readers is identifying the right places to submit your stories and not just submitting them everywhere. And so I think a part of that rejection might come on the writer's end too, because there is an element of finding the right people that will connect with what you're writing. And I do want to add on to what Kimberly did say about as a publisher. You say I don't handle the rejections; I send those on to somebody else. Um, well, at History Through Fiction, I do have to send the rejections. So I do want to just say that I sincerely appreciate every story that we get, every single narrative. I learn a lot, even if I'm not going to publish something. I learned so much history that I never would have learned about. Um, and I'm just so appreciative of the interest that someone has in our press. And I just appreciate that their submissions. And like Kimberly said, we have just such limited resources, and I have to think about so many different things. It's a lot more than just, is it good writing or not? Is this going to work for us at this specific place and time? Kim, any thoughts you want to add on that?
I would just agree with both of them. It's like you take it first, you're like, oh, so personal, or you're surprised by it. And Martha, I've had the same thing. Like some things I've been just like bowled over. Like, really? Not you rejected that? And other things I was like, I wouldn't want to be with those characters for 6 months anyway. So it's okay that you did that. But it's all about moving on to the next thing and determining where you're going to pivot and what you want to work on. And I've had things that I just go, okay, you really love this other idea. Go back to that idea. And then I just drive my agent crazy because I'm like, what about this? What about that? What about this? No, I changed my mind. I want to try this. And he's wonderful and says, whatever. I'll just wait for the manuscript. Yeah, it's not personal.
Yeah, definitely. It's part of it. Well, I want to end with one more question for each of you. Before I do, I want to thank our panelists for being here. This has been really wonderful. I want to thank our audience. We wouldn't have a panel if it weren't for our audience. If you haven't had a chance to check out those books, that link is in there now. It says "Get Your Book." It's a green button, so you can find the books there. I do see that Karna has already gone ahead and bought Kimberly's book, so that's great. And that's what we want to do here in What's New in Historical Fiction. We want to connect you with these great new books coming out. I apologize if anyone had technical difficulties. I did get some feedback that there were some. Hopefully there weren't for most of you, but regardless, this will be on replay. I'll put it on our YouTube channel. It'll be up on Facebook. And it's always available at this link, this Crowdcast link that we're on right now. Okay, so to finish up, I just want to hear from you, each of you, why historical fiction? What is the value of making a fictional narrative based on historical events and people, and why did you choose to write a story that way? So Kimberly, if you could start us off.
I think historical fiction is important because it's sometimes the only place people meet history, because they wouldn't necessarily do the research or pick up a history book. And so historical fiction, because as writers or authors in historical fiction do so much research, it sort of educates people about the time period. And I feel like that's definitely important to educate people in that way, because knowing our history, I think, helps us to kind of put the world in place where we are now and understand ourselves better.
Yeah, definitely helps us understand our world today. Kim, how about you? What do you think?
I've just always been endlessly fascinated with the past. So much more than now. I've always read historical fiction over everything else. I just find it's just people fascinate me, and how people lived in the past fascinate me, and how they thought and how they survived or how they flourished. So
Yeah, and readers like me, we're glad you can bring that to life for us. Martha, what do you think about the value of historical fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what both Kimberly and Kim have already said. Immersing myself in another world is just luxurious and wonderful to me, and that's what I look for in my fiction. I don't really want to I don't really want to be in the modern world sometimes. So it's a nice escape, and you learn something. I definitely feel like for me, the narrative structure of a story is the way humans remember things. It's the way I remember things. So things that I learn about what's happened in the past, if they're told in in the story way, they just stick with me a lot more. So, yeah.
Very well put. Well, thanks again to everybody. Thanks to our panelists. And if you haven't picked up their books yet, make sure you check them out. So thanks for joining us, and everyone, please have a good evening.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Colin.
Thank you
for
so
having us.
much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.